This is a group of presentations on global policies. In our conference presentation, we will outline and analyse various examples, causes and effects of global policies and reforms in countries such as Chile, Spain, Ghana, South Korea and the United States. How do these policies compare to those in our own country? Are there things we can learn from or apply to our own education practices?
My name is Claire Benoit. I'll be explaining the market-oriented reforms in both Chile and New Orleans. They are often referred to as school experiments, since in both cases, especially Chile, the systems were created anew without knowing exactly how things would turn out. In the name of science, though, these experiments must have a hypothesis. According to neoliberal ideologies, deregulated private school markets provide choices for parents, resulting in competition for students and their money. This may the best man win mentality will assumably allow the highest performing schools to rise to the top and the lowest performing schools to fizzle out and close. Standardized tests then serve as the ultimate accountability and comparison tool. Neoliberal reforms are condoned by those who believe in a laissez-faire system of governing. This emerges in education as privatization of schools, deregulation of schools, public vouchers, school markets, market-based teaching, and high-stakes standardized tests. My research analyzes the causes and consequences of market-based school experiments in both Chile and New Orleans in order to find out if the costs outweigh the benefits of neoliberal reforms, and really to offer a guide to those deciding if these policies should be replicated elsewhere or even in their own communities. As we know, the current administration advocates for expanding the market for charter schools, but it is our responsibility to familiarize ourselves with past and present examples of this to make informed decisions about whether privatizing is best. In Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, Naomi Klein connects the separate cases of extreme school reform in Chile and New Orleans, primarily by how their policies were so swiftly and widely actualized. According to the theory of disaster capitalism, there are two stages to forcefully spreading free market ideologies and practices. First, there is shock and awe, which can come in the form of extreme conflict, like in the case of Chile's dictatorship, or in the form of a natural disaster, like Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans' case. Economists then launch into the shock therapy stage, where they take advantage of the people's disoriented and needy state to impose capitalistic policies. Since they're too shocked to protest and in need of immediate relief, the people are forced to comply. The only way neoliberal policies were able to advance in Chile, for example, is because the voices of the educated and oppositional had been silenced by the Pinochet dictatorship that offered an initial shock to the system, which disoriented and terrified the population. During this time, educators, political antagonists, and other citizens that were deemed a threat to the dictatorship were interrogated in the most demeaning and inhumane of ways, and they were tortured and even killed. 3,197 murders are credited to the Pinochet regime, and this does not account for the people who disappeared or were not proven to be connected. Pinochet used this power to enforce neoliberal policies that he and his Chicago boys felt were best. The Chicago boys were young Chilean men that had been trained on the United States dime to attend the University of Chicago, whose professors in economics believed in a radical laissez-faire system of governing, believing that government should intervene as little as possible in the direction of economic affairs. As a matter of fact, the United States started laying the foundation for neoliberalism when they recruited about 100 Chilean men to be trained under Milton Friedman and his colleagues in opposition to what they saw as a threatening developmentalist / Marxist government. Between 1957 and 1970, about a third of the University of Chicago's population was Latin American. Among the university's professors in economics was the infamous Milton Friedman, or as Naomi Klein calls him, the grand guru of the movement for unfettered capitalism and the man credited with writing the rule book for the contemporary hypermobile global economy. Friedman saw in Chile an opportunity to try out this experiment and even served as an advisor to Pinochet. He is largely credited with advancing neoliberal policies like the privatization of schools. As one of his last legacies before his death in 2006, Milton Friedman had his hand in advancing market-based schooling in New Orleans, Louisiana, affectionately called NOLA, after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The population was in the shock and awe phase following the physical destruction of their schools and the loss of their family and friends, making it easy to swoop in and take advantage of the situation by revamping the school system with little community input. Even before the actual infrastructure of the schools was destroyed by Hurricane Katrina, the reputation of the public schools was crumbling. No Child Left Behind legislation had instituted a school system reliant on standardized tests. Approximately 80% of the students attended D or F schools, according to the Louisiana State Assessment in 2005. The locally elected officials of the Orleans Parish School Board were not only failing students academically, but were also embezzling millions of dollars in federal funds meant to remedy the situation. Several OPSB members resigned from their seats on the school board, and a few faced legal consequences for their corruptedness. With this in mind, it is somewhat justifiable that 112 out of the 120 public schools were taken over by the Recovery School District, RSD, to reconstruct the educational system. Though there are a few turnaround models that have been employed, NOLA chose the restart method, which replaces public schools with charter schools. By August 23, 2015, precisely 10 years after Hurricane Katrina, all eyes were on NOLA to decide if it really was the best thing that happened to the education system in New Orleans, as Secretary of Education Arne Duncan claimed. Frankly, reviews are mixed, but those who are most oppositional point to the persistent inequity among schools and the education they provide. In many ways, marketing education is driving urban neoliberalization and racialized dispossession. In New Orleans' case, the closing of public schools in the most needy neighborhoods stole the rights of those mostly black citizens to have a political voice in electing school board members, and stole their power of the symbol of collective action. Firing 7,500 union teachers that were also mostly black and replacing them with novice, mostly white teachers further stole their power to influence their home community. Allowing the charter schools to choose their locations resulted in the gentrifying of some neighborhoods and the disinvestment in many of the most needy neighborhoods. With these injustices in mind, the overall costs and benefits of privatized education will be difficult to assess since they differ and depend on the student's race, social class, and background. Nevertheless, proponents of the charter school system still attempt to paint a picture of improved ACT scores, more passing schools, and rising graduation rates. This data is only achieved when the Recovery School District, RSD data, is combined with the much higher scores of the Orleans Parish School Board, OPSB. In actuality, when separating these two very different populations of students, 42% of OPSB students reached mastery on the Louisiana State Test, while only 12% of the RSD students reached mastery on the same test in 2014. Considering that the OPSB schools were already scoring high on these exams before Hurricane Katrina and were allowed to continue as OPSB schools rather than being sacrificed to the RSD, it makes sense that these schools would continue to perform well. However, when analyzing the scores of RSD charters, scores are not improving. We shift our gaze to the right side of the slide and look at the data between those tiers of schools. The OPSB schools considered Tier 1 schools were allowed to continue with admission criteria like sibling preference and entrance exams, which weeds out the struggling students and raises scores. A breakdown of the three tiers of schools shows that it is only a downward progression from the top-performing OPSB schools to the RSD charter, and then to the alternative schools if students do not meet criteria and follow the rules. There is little moving up. Stark differences occur when moving from Tier 1 to Tier 2 schools. For example, in a Tier 1 school, an observer would notice mostly white students chatting as they move from class to class, but in a Tier 2 RSD charter school, an observer would likely see mostly black students walking silently in a single-file line, following the no excuses rules so as not to be expelled and sent to the alternative schools. Another difference is evident in the young and experienced teachers trained in the no excuses pedagogy that oversee the students. Many researchers point to the extreme segregation and resulting achievement gap that occurs when privatizing education. Increased segregation, increased achievement gaps between races and socioeconomic classes, inexperienced teachers, and declining or stagnant scores bring many researchers to the conclusion that the costs to the community outweigh the benefits in a market-based school system. Outcomes of market-oriented reforms in Chile parallel the segregation and inequity of those in New Orleans, but on a grander scale, as they have been in place since the 1973 to 1990 Pinochet dictatorship. The segregation that originally was rampant in schools has spread like a disease into the greater society as multiple generations of students have begun their lives in the working world. According to the Gini coefficient, the most accepted measure of inequality in a country, Chile ranks first with 0.5, and the United States ranks fourth in inequality among all nations. It was the students that spoke up against this discrimination first on a recognizable level in 2001, but even more noticeably in 2006 with the Penguin Revolution, named after the black and white public school uniforms. The young that are subjected to the market-based education have stood up consistently against the discrimination they experienced in school. Eventually, 4 students even earned student legislator positions in Chile Parliament's House of Representatives and have been working to bring more equality to schools and more opportunity to all students. By bringing more equity to all students, hopefully Chile can begin to address the rampant inequality in the whole nation. A more just education would give more unfortunate students a chance to catch up and close the wide income gap. So now what? When visiting Chile, I was most surprised and impressed by the level of student involvement. Admittedly, they have been experiencing the discrimination since the 1970s, but considering we live in a democracy, I would expect to see more students standing up for their rights to a thorough education. At one point, about 100 students in New Orleans walked out in protest to the high rates of expulsion. Just as they did in Chile, leaders listened and compromised for the students here. The school decided to implement a warning rule where students were given a warning first, which decreased the expulsions significantly. When analyzing the research, the voices of the students are what is missing the most. It should not take a revolution, as it did in Chile, for the students to be acknowledged. Effort should be made now to listen to the students' concerns and make adjustments accordingly before they feel the need to revolt.
Hi, my name is Allison Niarco, and I will be covering child trafficking in the Ghanaian fishing industry. The International Labor Organization has stated that the effective elimination of child labor is one of the most urgent challenges of our time. The occurrences of child trafficking and child labor are intertwined in social injustices and poverty, making it a problem that cannot be tackled in isolation. 60% of children affected by child labor are engaged in the agricultural sector. The Ghana Child Labor Survey, taken in 2003, states that over 49,000 children are involved in fishing in Ghana. Child labor and trafficking is a serious problem in Ghana, where about 1/3 of children between the ages of 7 and 14 work full-time. Throughout my presentation, I will be discussing child trafficking within the fishing industry in Ghana and what needs to be done in order to eradicate this problem of child labor in this industry. I will be answering this question through researching the causes of child labor in the fishing industry in Ghana, harmful effects trafficking has on children, policies currently in place, and progressive elimination strategies. Causes of child labor in Ghana. Poverty is considered the primary cause of child labor in Ghana and all throughout Africa. In trying to put a stop to widespread poverty, many families participate actively or are easily convinced into trafficking their children. Researchers reveal that as a part of the Ghanaian culture, it's acceptable and expected for children to begin working at young ages. It is thought that a level of work is deemed necessary to permit children to become responsible adults. However, it's often hard to differentiate between child labor and child trafficking for labor purposes. Many parents believe that they're actually helping their children by allowing them to acquire a skill that will enable them to fight against poverty in the future, for instance, the skill of fishing. Therefore, many parents do not consider the recruitment of their children to be detrimental for those reasons. Researchers highlight one specific group of Ghanaians, the Tongass, who regard fishing as an essential aspect of their cultural identity. They insist that their children learn the trade of fishing in order to pass it along from generation to generation, no matter what the circumstances may be. Researchers also address the fact that extended families are becoming more difficult to maintain, and therefore families are lacking childcare and support that traditionally extended families provide. And finally, female-headed households are becoming more popular. In such circumstances, the challenges of managing large households by single woman parents make children the weakest members of the family and vulnerable to exploitation. Effects trafficking has on children. The first effect that trafficking has on children is long working hours. Reports show that many children work between 6 to 7 days a week and at least 12 hours a day. This leaves them with very little to no sleep. Studies show that the most sleep that children receive in a night is approximately 3 hours. Children also report being hit with canoe paddles and fishing ropes while on the lake, as well as being beaten if they ask to go back to their parents, refuse to run errands, or ask for more food. Another effect trafficking has on children, primarily women, is sexual harassment. Many trafficked girls report frequently suffering from sexual harassment. There are also many work-related safety hazards that come along with working in the fishing industry. Some of these hazards include falling into canoes, injuries from ropes or nets, falling into the sea, fish stings, or canoes falling over. Many children are forced to dive into the water in order to get untangled nets, and this is the hazard that is most frequently mentioned as resulting in death. Children do not receive the proper medical care for injuries or illnesses that they sustain. A study along the Volta Lake revealed that only 6% of injured children were likely to be treated in a formal health facility. Those who are not treated in a health facility may receive hot water or herbal treatments or no treatment at all. Children also suffer from exposure to many elements of weather, snake bites, mosquitoes, and many different sicknesses. Lack of proper gear, including clothing and gloves, which can cause their hands to get cut from handling fish, lack of medical care, and little to no education. The pie graph in the top right-hand corner is a demonstration of the different education levels that children receive who are in trafficking. As you can see, that over half of the children have only received primary school education. The graph in the bottom right-hand corner is a graph demonstrating the proper gear that children receive. As you can see, that 93% of children do not receive gear at all to go fishing, no gloves, no clothing, and only 2% do receive the proper gear. Policies currently in place. In Ghana, there are currently 2 policies in place that address child trafficking. The first policy is the Children's Act, or the Act 560 of 1998. Under this act, no person should deprive children access to education, immunizations, adequate diet, clothing, shelter, medical attention, or any other thing required for his development. Furthermore, no person should subject a child to exploitative labor, and the best interest of the child shall be paramount in all other matters concerning a child. This legislation was imitative of Britain's 1989 Children's Act, to which it closely resembles. Many authors report that the effective implementation of the Children's Act could have protected the Ghanaian children on the Volta Lake from maltreatment. However, other authors argue that these laws significantly ignore the socio-economic and cultural relations of Ghana, and thus they're flawed and ineffective. The economic backdrop to daily life in Ghana confronts social workers with different dilemmas from those presented in the UK. One author goes on to give an example of a British infant who was not receiving proper immunizations or suffering from malnutrition would be subject to child protection procedures on the grounds of neglect, similarly to the United States. However, the stunned or underweight infant, in which 1 in 3 Ghanaian children are so affected, is the product of a very different family circumstance from those pertaining in Britain. This author continues to explain that high poverty levels, especially in rural areas, have a high impact against children receiving significant medical resources or nutrition to meet basic needs. Therefore, provisions of child welfare programs and services have to be largely left to foreign and local non-governmental organizations. Progressive elimination strategies. The best strategy for the progressive elimination of child trafficking is certainly not cut and dry. Many researchers and authors have varying opinions of the most effective way to eradicate child labor in the fishing industry. Many researchers believe that rigorous implementation of the Human Trafficking Act, as well as severe forms of child labor exploitation being criminalized, would make a huge impact. However, others believe that it is unlikely that any further legislation in the form of the 1998 Children's Act will make any further impact, and the rest of the system remains the same. Another approach seeks to empower individuals, families, and communities through the process of making them conscious about child protection in order to take informed and voluntary decisions and action towards the elimination of different forms of child labor in fisheries. Another author cites creating formal vocational education training in fishing. Since there's no educational institutes in Ghana that teach fishing, there is a need for formal vocational education and training in fishing that improves upon the traditional techniques, technologies, ethics, and safety practices in fishing. Another strategy is to invest in future human capital of the region by providing preventative and supportive social services to vulnerable families that are incapable of meeting the parental responsibilities toward the development of their children. Another author cites the importance of economic development programs that can directly improve living conditions, as well as providing rural regions with adequate infrastructure for education and health. And lastly, one author addresses the need for further research studies on the living conditions of rescued children and strategies to be implemented in order to avoid their re-trafficking, as well as the need to create more awareness on this issue.
So for my research project, I studied the effects of multilingual instruction on national identity in Catalonia, Spain. More specifically, I looked at the attitudes and behaviors of primary and secondary students in the region of Catalonia. My goal in this was to kind of figure out how the use of Catalan as a co-official state language and also as the primary language of instruction affects these students' ability to identify with their nationality, whether it be Catalonia or Spain. Through this research, my goal is to share with others how language can act as a key tool in deriving significance and meaning in regards to cultural and national identity. Catalan is the official language of Catalonia, which is an autonomous region in the eastern part of Spain. Catalonia has a history of repression in that they lost their independence in the 15th century, their autonomy in the 18th century, and during the Franco regime, Catalan was banned entirely. Because of this, tensions have continued to be pretty high between Catalonia and the rest of Spain, despite gaining autonomy once again after Franco's death in 1975. And while the majority agreed that Catalonia be established again as its own entity with its own language and culture, there were still feelings of nationalism that endured among those outside of the region, namely from Madrid, and those kind of feelings still persist today. The intent of those feelings is that Spain and its inhabitants identify as a whole rather than embracing the multilingualism that exists not only in Catalonia but also in other regions, such as the Basque region and Galicia, which are northern parts of Spain. Despite these nationalist feelings, however, there were still efforts made post-Franco to kind of reestablish the Catalan cultural identity. This started with the most significant event, which was the passing of the Language Normalization Law in 1983, or the Education Reform as it's known more casually. This law marked an era of mass change for Catalonia as a whole, but specifically in regards to the ways in which students would learn and grow in this new quote-unquote identity. The education reform named Catalan as a co-official state language, meaning that both Catalan and Spanish would act as official languages in the region. And also it required that students have competency in both Catalan and Spanish by the end of compulsory education, so by the age of approximately 16. The goal in this law was to eventually have Catalan as the primary language of instruction in all schools in Catalonia, so that meant that eventually they wanted all classes to be taught in Catalan. However, some initial issues that they ended up with were the fact that there were a lack of Catalan-speaking teachers who were qualified to teach the language, and due to an influx of immigrant workers in the Franco era due to the industrialization in Catalonia, there was a high majority of Spanish-speaking immigrants, so almost as many, if not more, than Catalan-speaking natives. Though the population has since evened out, there continue to be struggles for minority groups, not so much on their ability to learn and speak the Catalan language, but on their ability to identify with their nationality, be it Catalonia or Spain. And this goes for students who also have lived and grown up in Catalonia as well, as their parents were from Catalonia. All of these students have found issues with their identity, which leads me to my point of study, which is over identity politics, or the factors that go into a person's sense of identity, such as cultural, political, religious factors, things like that. I started by looking at an in-depth study of how students in Catalonia are identifying with the nationality and the observed factors at play. One of these studies included a series of focus group interviews with students of varying backgrounds in Catalan public schools. The goal of this research was to observe the identity politics of these students. And what the researchers found was that there were 6 ideological stances, as the authors put it, that students were identifying with. Those included parochial Catalan, so I only identify as Catalan; mixed Catalan, which is I am Catalan, but I understand that Spain is the overall; cosmopolitan Catalan, which is I am both Catalan and Spanish; cosmopolitan Spanish, which is I am both Spanish and Catalan; mixed Spanish, which is I am Spanish, I speak Spanish, but I am okay with Catalan; and parochial Spanish, which is I am only Spanish and I don't speak Catalan unless I have to. The findings of the study kind of provide a basis for how students are identifying with either Catalan or Spanish, and kind of give us an idea of how ethnic origin or background comes into play as far as students' ability to identify with a nationality in particular. It also shows the significance of parental influence, where your parents grew up and what their ideologies are. In regards to ethnic background, minority groups play a unique and important role in a country with sub-state nations like Spain. In a longitudinal study of 4 immigrant students, it was shown that between a period of 20 years, these 4 students' ideologies kind of changed a little bit. So when they started school with speaking little to no Catalan to the time that they had graduated higher education, they had kind of different mixed feelings about Catalan. These students were all Spanish immigrants, so they were from other areas in Spain. And relating back to the categories of identity that I mentioned earlier, they fell into the groups of parochial Spanish, cosmopolitan Spanish, and mixed Spanish. One male stated that despite any and all experience that he had learning and being engulfed in Catalan culture, he was still Spanish at heart and had no reason to change from that. The others were more cosmopolitan in their viewpoints, and that they kind of saw it as an academic or personal achievement that they learned Catalan and were able to communicate in Catalan in a different region of Spain. And another student even said that Catalan was part of another life experience that she could add to her character, so that she did a lot of world traveling and she saw it as, another thing under her belt to share and build character. These different attitudes about language from these 4 students kind of are seen to be similar with many other minority students in my research. Another element to consider, however, is immigrants from other Spanish-speaking countries outside of Spain. So say, a student from Ecuador or Guatemala comes to Spain as an immigrant, what are their viewpoints towards learning Catalan versus Spanish? One study in particular explores how the education reform affects the ability of these minority groups to integrate into Catalan society. And they found that while some more affluent groups willing to embrace this new identity despite their Spanish language roots, and others in less affluent communities had trouble not just identifying with a new language, but also integrating into Catalan or mixed friend groups. In these communities, despite Catalan being taught in schools, Spanish is still the primary language of use among friends and families. So, if the goal of the education reform and of the Catalan government is to establish a new overall national identity, this could pose a problem. And like many areas, even in the States, the difference between public and private education can play a large role in the types of quality of education that these students are getting, how much Catalan they are being exposed to, and the like. On top of this, the language normalization law states that there may not be separate schools based on language. So there may not be Spanish versus Catalan schools. They are all integrated together, although Spanish families may choose to start their children in a school that teaches in their mother tongue, so Spanish, but they must, at the end of compulsory education, be competent in both Catalan and Spanish. Another interesting factor in identity politics is found through a broader look at how students perceive themselves. For example, as a resident of Illinois, I would say that I am from Illinois, but that I'm also from the United States. In Spain, students may say that they are from Spain as a whole, from Catalonia, disregarding Spain, or even that they are from Europe, as Spain is a part of the EU. One study found that many students neglected to recognize themselves as part of the EU when asked about their identity or nationality. This related heavily to whether they identified with either Spain or Catalonia. Students who recognized themselves as belonging to the EU were more likely to state that their nationality is Spain, while those who did not stated that their nationality was Catalan. These findings demonstrate specifically that historical curriculum has a large role in students' global perception. So if schools in Catalonia are strictly teaching their own history, as opposed to Spanish history as a whole, this could potentially have a strong effect on not only national identification, but also attitudes towards Spain as a whole, namely negative attitudes. One author, Olivieri, draws off of these ideas in his discussion on sub-state nationalism in Spain. He explains that identity conflicts are particularly high in Catalonia as opposed to other regions of Spain, and on top of curriculum, factors such as symbols, flags, and events can affect students' identification. One example is the 2010 World Cup victory, which was won by Spain, and while Spain won, many in Catalonia argue that it was a victory for Catalonia, given that many players on the team were from Catalonia. Similarly, there are various symbols, flags, and musical tastes which students use to distinguish themselves as either Spanish or Catalan. And these attitudes or these preferences can play into whether a student will choose to identify one way or the other. This specifically relates back to discussions on the family and peer groups as having the most significant role in whether or not a student identifies with his or her culture, or the argument, I should say. As I mentioned earlier, for some students, namely minority students, the language that they use and speak at school, which is Catalan, has nothing to do with what they use at home with their friends and their family. Hierro found that among some minority groups, Spanish was still spoken among them in school when they were not in class speaking Catalan. So if a student is only using Catalan because he or she has to, then it can be said that they do not truly identify with the culture. Similarly, many families who grew up during the Franco regime have strong cultural allegiances toward Catalan, and they will push for their children to identify just as strictly with Catalan rather than Spanish. These contrasting ideologies have been seen to cause problems for students growing up in a sub-state climate. Currently, there are still lingering feelings of nationalism and separatism from Catalonia, mainly due to economic reasons. However, it has been shown that in this generation there has been an adaptation of more cosmopolitan attitudes or more acceptance from these generations of the use of Catalan and Spanish, and there being less animosity towards the two. Furthermore, it is shown that the education reform has been working in the sense that the percentage of students or people in Catalonia who are fluent in both Catalan and Spanish has risen greatly. Still, it can be argued that just because one is fluent in a language does not mean that they identify with it either culturally or nationally. These same identity conflicts can likely be applied to the United States climate, in that there are many immigrants speaking a variety of different languages, but do they identify as American or do they identify with their original culture? The answer could be both, but there is undoubtedly pressure from the overarching society to assimilate or integrate into that culture. The same could likely be said for those living in Catalonia, especially in the younger generations whose parents may have grown up with strong Catalan ties, but who would like to integrate more into the Spanish society as a whole, or vice versa. These questions are what I seek to answer in my literature review. Thank you.
My name's Harriet Mansfield, and I'm looking at globalization in the South Korean education system and whether education policies reflect the government's active globalization policies. South Korea has dealt with incredibly rapid industrialization over the last 50 years and has gone from being a poverty-struck nation to being a fully industrialized nation and an active member of the OECD. South Korea is incredibly unique as a nation in that it has created active policies towards globalization, with Singapore being another one of these few countries. The second democratically elected South Korean president, Kim Jong-sam, stated that the government was going to forge ahead with policies that reflect globalization in all sectors, including education. Some papers claim that policies in education aren't keeping up with globalization policies, and in other areas it is undeniable that there are advances. It is important to provide some background context to education in South Korea, an increasingly globalized nation. The last century has been a tumultuous one on the Korean peninsula. The Japanese occupation made it compulsory for students to learn through Japanese and say an oath to Japan daily. The Japanese occupation undoubtedly eroded culture and denied dissent, although it is of note that the Japanese occupation introduced the education system that is still in place today in Korea. After the occupation ended, Korea suffered from the Korean War, the Asian financial crisis, and a plethora of failed attempts at education reform. Despite all of this, the Korean literacy rate has risen dramatically in the last 60 years, from 22% in the 1940s to now being the highest in the OECD. One important factor to note about Korean globalization is that South Korea named their globalization Segaehwa, a term that is used even in English language publications. This is considered a kind of globalization that has specific Korean characteristics that protect their culture and identity. Tying into the nationalism of the Korean Segaehwa globalization, South Korea is often considered in the literature as being incredibly statist. This is something that's understandable in many ways, considering both the historical and current situation in Korea. South Korea has dealt with occupation and war and still live with thousands of US troops in the country, along with the very real risk of attack from North Korea. In many regards, this results in a very real risk of their culture being eroded, and many people claim that this is what's led to the statism. The statist policies restrict economic and civilian activity and are strongly reflected in the education system. Examples of this would be that all schools, including private day schools, are controlled by the government, with their curriculums and activities heavily monitored. On top of this, civilian groups that would typically push for education reform in other countries are discouraged in South Korean society. Some South Korean education policies certainly seem at odds with the globalization that the government is pushing for. As mentioned previously, the textbooks used in South Korean schools are state-mandated. These are seen as having a glossed-over form of Korean history, with books with negative views or published abroad are banned from being used in daily schools. On top of impacting upon social studies education, this also impacts upon language education. Not only are books from abroad banned, but there are severe restrictions on the timing and amount of English allowed to be taught in schools. For example, students are not meant to study English during the school day at all in the first 2 years of school. Instead of being a fallback from history, this is something that in many ways has gotten more pronounced under the government. In In 2015, Park Geun-hye's government imposed stricter regulations on the textbooks. Furthermore, the Korean education system is incredibly test-based, something that was started to try and bring about an increase in equality. However, this has had the opposite effect. The resulting proliferation of cram schools that provide extra education has led to an increase in inequality. Many Koreans will spend up to half of their salary on private education, meaning that students who don't have these advantages and access will suffer. On top of this, multicultural learning is seen as low, with few exceptions made for multicultural students. Along with this, Korean textbooks still have a very ethnocentric version of what it is to be a Korean citizen. Despite the amount of restrictive Korean policies towards education, there is no doubt that advances are being made. Universities are boosting international competitiveness with pushes for increased international students and publications. Analyses of South Korean textbooks show that despite strong nationalistic themes, there are increases in global citizen themes. They also reflect a more student-centered learning, and several studies suggest that there's an increase in multicultural learning. There are many policies in Korean education that don't reflect South Korea's government's globalization policies. However, it cannot be denied that there are advances being made. South Korea has joined the OECD and is a major competitor in many ways in the international field. In education, they have strong PISA levels, which is the international test of student achievement. Universities, schools, and textbook authors are all developing increased awareness of the need to increase global research and inclusiveness. Some literature points to shortfalls in globalization policies in education and internal barriers to reform, but there is also evidence of improvements in policy alignment.
Okay, this is Michelle Thomas, and my presentation and my research focused on the Illinois state budget, particularly its crisis that it's found itself in over the last couple of years, and the Chicago gun violence that's seen a rise in gun violence over the past 5 years. So I wanted to focus particularly on the past 5 years, but there is some historical context that I put into the presentation as well. So I wanted to choose this topic because it's really important to me from a professional standpoint. I work in Chicago as a youth outreach professional for young people who are either homeless, at risk of being homeless, just out of juvie, just out of foster care system, things like that. And these are kids who are affected by the gun violence on a daily basis. So that was really important for me to focus on from a professional standpoint, and also just a personal standpoint. I've lived in the area my entire life, and I really wanted to focus on something within the United States, because for other classes, actually within the Global Studies program, I've studied a lot of in-depth topics regarding education and women's rights in Chile and Saudi Arabia, for example. So I wanted to focus on something here, something that I work with on an everyday basis, which was really important to me, so that in order to, so hopefully that one day I can implement some change that will help the city's youth, which is not a one-person fix by any means, but I would love to be able to contribute to that. So I've done a little bit of research on my own regarding the topic, just out of personal interest, which gave me a pretty good launch point, but this research allowed me to go a little bit deeper and focus on a topic that I'm really passionate about, so I enjoyed that. One thing I tried to do as much as possible, given that this is an education course, was relate the failing state budget and citywide budget of Chicago to education within the Chicago public school system. So I tried to focus that back as much as I could throughout my research. And again, the goal of my research is just to highlight the parallels between the state budget and citywide budget and the rise in gun violence, particularly budget cuts to social services and education and things like that, and the alarming rise in gun violence. So it's my hope that this research will just continue to encourage the conversation with law and policymakers in Chicago and in Illinois, and so that they can see that cutting funding to community resources and public schools further perpetuates, or in my opinion, which has been supported by a little bit of research, also instigates some gun violence. So to the next slide, I wanted to highlight my top 5 the next slide, I wanted to highlight my top 5 resources that I used during my research that I found to be the most helpful. The first one was from the University of Illinois Crime Lab, which this journal was enormous to go through, so it was important for me to really take the important bits from it. And the content in the source was actually incredibly useful just overall. So it's a group of independent researchers that identified the most effective and humane ways to control crime and violence in Chicago. And throughout this article, the researchers were connected with the Chicago Police Department for as accurate of research as possible, which, given if we had more time, more than the 8 weeks in this course, I would have loved to dive deeper and actually speak with Chicago Chicago Police Department, firefighters, teachers, things like that, but save that for another time. And so out of all the sources, this laid the framework the best, I think, in terms of statistics, providing facts, just like 764 murders in Chicago in 2016. So just kind of to get the ground facts and statistics. And it was really relevant and encouraging further research, like I was saying, into exactly what the budget cuts were to Chicago public schools in 2016 to see how that correlated with the gun violence, because in 2016 alone, or between 2015 and 2016, there was a 58% increase in gun violence, resulting in homicide, which is very rare for us, very rare for Chicago given its size. So anyway, there was just a lot of useful content in this article, which I could incorporate into my project, specifically focusing on the most disadvantaged neighborhoods who are affected the most by gun violence on the south and west sides, particularly Englewood, if anyone's familiar with Chicago, Englewood, or West Garfield Park on the west side. So the second article was the Anti-Violence Programs End Due to Illinois Budget Crisis. The article stuck out to me just because it's pretty spot on what I was looking for. It was from Chicago Tribune. But it provided information regarding the cutting of funding to a ceasefire program, it was called. And that was an initiative that was started in 2011 for former gang members in Chicago and ex-felons to intervene on feuds between gangs before it escalated to fatal gun violence. So kind of doing street outreach for ex-gang members to find current gang members and hopefully, de-escalate some of the violence that would have ensued had they not gotten involved. And what was interesting was that the article suggests that the initiative proved to have positive feedback, but unfortunately, just shortly after it started in 2011, all the funding towards the project was quote-unquote frozen, aka cut, by the city due to state budget cuts. So that's kind of what triggered my research in the first place, just seeing an effective program working. Statistically, research proves that it's working, yet it's still being cut. So just another bit from the article was that the deadliest weekend in Chicago typically is the 4th of July, and 2 of the neighborhoods under the ceasefire program initiative were the least impacted that year over the 4th of July while the program was still up and running. So again, proven to have worked, but yet being cut of funding. So, and actually the ceasefire program was modeled after other successful programs. I can't remember the name, but successful programs in LA and in New York. So I just thought that was interesting that they took that kind of model and adapted it to Chicago. Also, just not to put too much on that article, but it got me thinking that there was a bit talking about how because of the funding cuts to Illinois, private foundations are having to give out bigger grants, and there's also some more kind of grassroots fundraising, which to me kind of sounded like a political problem being solved by a philanthropic solution or a temporary solution. So that's something that I wanted to explore also. The third article was helpful, just shedding some background on the initiatives in Chicago Public Schools that implemented multidisciplinary violence prevention strategies. And there's a lot to say about this article, but the biggest thing is that it gave some historical context for Chicago Public Schools in the 90s, which was at the last height of the violence during the crack cocaine epidemic throughout the nation, but particularly in Chicago, it was at an all-time high. So I really enjoyed learning about that and just kind of cross-comparing it as much as I could. The fourth article, titled pretty self-explanatory, just again laid statistical framework, providing facts and figures, which was needed. I'm not much of a numbers person, but it was very helpful just in terms of this research. And the fifth was a detailed breakdown of what, when, and why programs were being cut. So, or according to them, why they cut it. So that's kind of the next slide, just kind of in summary, was I tried to pick a variety of sources, whether it was scholarly articles or informative pieces from the Chicago Tribune and opinion pieces too from Chicago residents that provided testimony in the neighborhoods that were affected most by the violence. And the commonalities between all the sources were that the two issues, being depleting funding and increased violence, were talked about in all articles in different ways, either directly or indirectly, and they would talk about it. Either a resident of the area would talk about it, saying that we're being neglected in these particular neighborhoods, and then a different piece would talk from a political standpoint, saying, well, this is where budget cut needs to happen, and so on and so forth. So it was interesting to highlight that, which in my paper I'll kind of tie all those together because they really did intertwine a bit. And then going back to what I was talking about, the philanthropic solution to a political problem. In spite of all the budget cuts and the increased violence, I think it does yield a little bit of positivity, seeing communities come together and saying, we're not going to stand for this anymore, and kind of having this philanthropic community effort to protect their communities and to end the violence as much as they could. So I researched a little bit. I know just a couple of things. Community leaders, in particularly Inglewood, over Memorial Day, which is also a very, very deadly weekend in Chicago, some community activists came out and set up tournaments, chess tournaments, checkers tournaments, just something for kids to do so that they're not getting involved so much in gang violence, or even more importantly, staying out of harm's way from stray bullets, which is a lot, which happens a lot to the kids in Chicago. They are not targeted. Sometimes they are, but they'll be caught by a stray bullet. So this kind of gave kids somewhere to go. We're also seeing, again, private foundations giving large multi-year grants for programs to stay afloat. And I'm also seeing kind of celebrity involvement, whether it's athletes or rappers or musicians, artists from the city investing back into their city, realizing that there's a problem and donating money on behalf of the city because they know that the deficit is so big, which I found to be encouraging. So there is some positivity with all this, but sometimes it's hard to see just because Chicago's always in the media for gun violence. So I just wanted to incorporate a little bit of positive light on a horrible situation. So in the end,
overall, what I noticed throughout my research was that there needs to be some more kind of case study, longitudinal research done in these particular neighborhoods to really closely watch how the budget of Illinois, as well as citywide budget, affects these particular neighborhoods. So 5-year, 10-year studies, longitudinal kind of case studies would be really beneficial in seeing what works, in seeing what community resources are being cut that are extremely detrimental to the community as well as to the Chicago Public Schools. And then just very briefly, that the biggest thing that I took away from the research is that it's not just a budget problem, it's a multi-level problem, and there's no quick fix just by balancing a budget at the state level or the city level. So that was that was a big thing that I noticed, and it's such a multi-level problem, such as rebuilding neighborhoods, providing access to healthcare, improving the bonding and connectedness dynamics within the community and its stakeholders, improving in the self-esteem of youth as well as their social skills, and reducing residual effects to trauma and PTSD. It's an all-encompassing, multi-layer problem. In order to address the violence, it is not just a one-stop fix the budget and that's going to solve everything. So I really took that away from the project. I hope you enjoy my presentation, and thank you very much.
These presentations address different education policies amongst varying countries around the globe. They all assess data reflecting the efficacy of policies in place and how things can be improved. It is important for both educators and policymakers to constantly assess the literature in order to explore and implement best practices.